At Thanksgiving dinner, my husband's cousin laughed and asked if my Navy career was just posing for recruitment posters. My husband said nothing. Then his father looked straight at me and asked, "What's your call sign?" And just like that, the entire table went quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet either. The kind where people suddenly remember they're holding forks. The kind where nobody wants to be the next person to speak. I wish I could tell you I had some clever response ready. I didn't. I was too surprised. The funny thing is, the evening had started out completely normal. It was Thanksgiving at the Harlan family's house in Chesapeake, Virginia. The same split-level brick home they'd lived in for nearly 30 years. The place always smelled like turkey coffee and furniture polish. Every November, the driveway filled with pickup trucks and SUVs carrying relatives from all over Hampton Roads. My husband Mark and I arrived around 4:30. The sun was already dropping low. Cold wind. Gray sky. Typical coastal Virginia holiday weather. I remember climbing out of the passenger seat and taking a second before standing upright. My right knee had been bothering me all week. Old injury. Some mornings it felt fine. Some mornings it reminded me exactly how old I wasn't supposed to feel at 39. "You okay?" Mark asked. I shut the car door. "Yeah." He looked at me. "You sure?" I said yeah. That should have been my first clue. When a simple question annoys you, something's already off. Inside the house, football was playing in the living room. Kids were running around with paper plates. Somebody had burned a batch of dinner rolls. My mother-in-law was pretending not to be stressed while being obviously stressed. Normal family holiday stuff. For the first hour, everything felt fine. I helped in the kitchen, talked to a few relatives, answered questions about work without actually talking about work. Most people hear Navy and immediately start asking questions. Where have you been? What ships? Any crazy stories? After enough years, you learn how to smile without saying much. Some things aren't classified. They're just personal. Around 6 o'clock, everyone finally sat down. The adults squeezed around the long dining table. The kids took over folding tables nearby. I ended up sitting across from Jake Harlan. That was unfortunate. Jake was 31, a Navy lieutenant, smart guy, talented, also one of the most exhausting human beings I've ever met. Every conversation somehow became about Jake, his accomplishments, his future, his plans, his opinions. If Oxygen could file a complaint, it probably would have. When I sat down, he was already talking about an upcoming leadership presentation he'd be giving at Naval Station Norfolk. And the commander specifically requested me. He was saying. Nobody had asked. Jake kept going anyway. His mother beamed proudly. His father sat quietly. I noticed that. Robert Harlan wasn't a loud man. Retired Navy Command Master Chief. 70 years old. Sharp eyes. The kind of guy who could say 3 words and somehow make everybody else reconsider their life choices. While Jake talked, Robert mostly listened. About halfway through dinner, somebody asked me how work was going. "Busy," I said. That was apparently enough to irritate Jake. He leaned back, smirked. "Still flying?" Sometimes. Sometimes. I shrugged. "Depends on what's needed." Jake laughed. That's the most officer answer I've ever heard. A couple people chuckled politely. I smiled. No big deal. Then he kept going. "You know what I always find funny?" Nobody answered. That never stopped Jake. The public has this image of military life. He gestured with his fork. Especially Navy officers. I took a sip of iced tea. I already knew where this was headed. Jake looked directly at me. "You're still in the Navy, right?" "Last time I checked." More laughter. Then he delivered the line. "So what's your job these days?" I shrugged. "Same as before." Jake grinned. "Let me guess." I felt my stomach tighten. "Jake," his mother said, but she was smiling. That made it worse. Jake pointed his fork toward me. "Your main job is posing for recruitment posters." A few people laughed. Not everyone. Just enough. The kind of laugh people use when they don't want to challenge someone. I stared at him. Not angry. Not yet. Mostly disappointed. Because I'd heard versions of that joke before. Sometimes from strangers. Sometimes from people who assumed women only advanced because they looked good in uniform. It wasn't original. It was just tired. Before I could answer, Aunt Patty jumped in. "Oh, come on. Dana does photograph well." A few more laughs. I looked at Mark. Just for a second. He was staring down at his plate. That hurt more than Jake's joke. I wasn't expecting a speech. I wasn't expecting a dramatic defense. One sentence would have been enough. Just one. Instead, he stayed quiet. Jake mistook my silence for surrender. Big mistake. He leaned forward. "Hey, I'm kidding." Nobody responded. Then he added, "Mostly." That got another laugh. Smaller this time. Uneasy. I could feel the room starting to shift. People weren't comfortable anymore, even if they didn't know why. That's when I heard a fork touch a plate. A soft metallic sound. Robert Harlan had set his fork down. Slowly, deliberately. The table quieted. He looked at me. Not Jake. Not anyone else. Me. Dana. "Yes, sir." His voice stayed calm. "What was your call sign?" Jake immediately snorted. "Dad, come on." Robert ignored him. "What was it?" For a moment, I considered dodging the question. I didn't like talking about that part of my career. I never had. But Robert waited. So I answered, "Jukebox." The reaction was immediate. Not from everyone, just from him. His eyes widened slightly. Not much, but enough. Enough that I noticed. Enough that Jake noticed too. Robert sat back. Then he looked at me in complete disbelief. "You're Jukebox Mercer." I nodded once. Across the table, Jake frowned. "What does that mean?" Nobody answered. Robert kept staring at me. Then he slowly turned toward his son. The disappointment on his face hit harder than any angry outburst could have. "Jake!" "What?" "You should have stopped talking about 5 minutes ago." The room froze. Jake laughed nervously. "Dad, what are you talking about?" Robert shook his head, almost to himself. "No idea." The rest of dinner never recovered. Conversation stumbled along awkwardly. People tried changing subjects. Football, weather, travel plans. Nobody really succeeded. And through it all, I kept thinking about one thing. Not Jake. Not Robert. Not even the call sign. I kept thinking about Mark. Because the man sitting beside me had watched the entire thing happen, and he hadn't said a word. About 20 minutes later, I excused myself and walked down the hallway toward the bathroom. I closed the door behind me, looked into the mirror. For a few seconds I just stood there. The woman looking back wasn't weak. She wasn't inexperienced. She wasn't a poster. But somehow, that night standing in my in-laws' bathroom while relatives laughed down the hallway, I felt smaller than I had in years. And the worst part was knowing the evening wasn't really about one stupid joke. It was about what happened when the people closest to you decided your dignity was optional. I had survived storms, deployments, and emergencies that still visited me in dreams. But standing there under that yellow bathroom light fighting tears, I refused to let anyone see. I realized something. What hurt most wasn't Jake's disrespect. It was my husband's silence. The drive home was quiet, not the peaceful kind. The kind that settles in after something ugly happens and nobody wants to touch it. Outside Chesapeake was mostly dark, except for porch lights and Christmas decorations that had already started appearing the day after Thanksgiving. We passed neighborhoods full of inflatable snowmen and glowing reindeer. Inside the car, all I could hear was the hum of the tires and the occasional click of the turn signal. Mark drove. I stared out the passenger window. For 20 minutes, neither of us spoke. I kept replaying the dinner in my head. Jake's smirk. The laughter. The way Aunt Patty had smiled while making everything worse. Most of all, Mark staring at his plate. Finally, he sighed. "Jake's an idiot." I kept looking out the window. "Okay. That's all you've got." "What do you want me to say?" He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I'm saying he's an idiot." I nodded. "Yeah." Another minute passed. Then he said something that immediately made me angry. He was joking. I turned toward him. "Seriously." Mark glanced at me. "I'm not defending him." "Sounds like it." "I'm saying that's how Jake is." I laughed. One sharp, humorless laugh. "That's your defense." "It's not a defense." Then what is it? Mark didn't answer. Because he didn't have one. We stopped at a red light. I looked at the dashboard clock. 8:41 p.m. A normal Friday night for most people. For me, it felt like something had shifted. Not dramatically, not permanently, just enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. When the light turned green, Mark spoke again. I didn't want to make Thanksgiving worse. There it was, the sentence I'd been waiting for. I looked at him. For who? His jaw tightened. Dana. No. I shook my head. For who? He didn't answer. Because we both knew the answer. Not for me. For him. For his parents. For the family gathering. For everybody except the person sitting next to him. The rest of the drive was silent. When we got home to our townhouse in Norfolk, I changed clothes and cleaned up the kitchen, even though there wasn't much to clean. Sometimes I do that when I'm upset. Keeps my hands busy. Mark hovered nearby, trying to figure out whether he should talk. Trying to figure out whether he should leave me alone. Failing at both. Eventually, he leaned against the counter. Dana. I didn't look up. What? I'm sorry. I rinsed a coffee mug. For some reason that made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it felt so inadequate. Sorry for what? Dana. No, seriously. I set the mug down. Sorry for what? Mark rubbed the back of his neck. I should have said something. Yeah. I know. Do you? That landed harder than I intended. He looked tired. Honestly, so did I. The difference was that I wasn't ready to let him off the hook. You could have said one sentence, I said quietly. I know. One. I know. You didn't need to fight anybody. He nodded. I know. I crossed my arms. Then why didn't you? For a moment, I thought he might actually answer. Instead, he looked away. And that told me everything. Mark hated conflict. Always had. It was one of the reasons people liked him. Students liked him. Neighbors liked him. Family liked him. The downside was that avoiding conflict sometimes meant avoiding responsibility. And tonight I was paying for it. Eventually, he said, My family gets weird about military stuff. I stared at him. Your family got weird about me being respected. He didn't have a response for that either. Around 10:30 we went to bed. At least we tried. Mark fell asleep relatively quickly. I didn't. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it spin, watching shadows move across the room, thinking. That's dangerous after midnight, especially when you're already hurt. Your brain starts collecting evidence. Every insecurity you've ever had suddenly wants a turn at the microphone. Mine certainly did. At 1 a.m, I got up and went downstairs. Made coffee I didn't need. Sat at the kitchen table. Outside the neighborhood was completely quiet. Inside, I found myself thinking about things I hadn't thought about in years. Not missions. Not deployments. The aftermath. The physical part. The stuff nobody puts in recruitment commercials. The surgeries. The rehab. The knee that never quite healed right. The lower back pain that appeared sometime around 36 and apparently decided to stay forever. The extra weight that showed up after my second deployment and refused to leave no matter how many miles I ran. I wasn't overweight, but I wasn't 25 anymore either. And if I'm being honest, there were days that bothered me more than I liked admitting. You spend enough years in aviation, and your body becomes part of the job. Then one day, you realize time has been working on your body while you've been busy working on everything else. I looked down at my coffee. Cold already. Somewhere upstairs, Mark shifted in bed. I thought about the joke again. Poster girl. What bothered me wasn't the insult itself. It was how familiar it felt. Not because people had said those exact words. Because every woman in uniform hears versions of it eventually. You got promoted because you're attractive. You got opportunities because you're female. You got noticed because somebody needed diversity. Never because you're qualified. Never because you earned it. The details change. The message stays the same. And the worst part, sometimes after enough years a tiny piece of you starts wondering if other people believe it too. Even people who love you. I hated that thought. But it was there. Around 2:30 a.m, I wandered into the bathroom. The scale sat in the corner. I stared at it. then stepped on. Immediately regretted it. Smart move, Dana. I laughed quietly, talking to myself at 2:30 in the morning. That's usually a sign you're having a great night. I climbed back into bed sometime after 3. Sleep still wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself thinking about shore duty. The thought surprised me. For years I'd brushed off suggestions about stepping back, taking something easier, something quieter. But that night, the idea sounded tempting. No more flying. No more proving myself. No more rooms full of people who thought they knew me. Just peace. The fact that I even considered it scared me. Because Jake wasn't important enough to influence my future. Yet somehow he had gotten inside my head anyway. The next morning I woke up exhausted. Mark was already downstairs. I could smell bacon cooking. His version of an apology. When I came into the kitchen, he looked up. "Morning." I nodded. "Morning." He slid a plate toward me. I sat down. Neither of us spoke. Then my phone buzzed. Family group text. I glanced down. The message was from Ellen Harlan. "Hope everyone had a lovely Thanksgiving. Let's remember Jake was only teasing. We love our military girls." I stared at the screen. Military girls. I was 39 years old. A lieutenant commander. Thousands of flight hours. Years of service. And somehow, I had become one of the military girls. I almost laughed. Instead, I locked my phone. A few seconds later, it buzzed again. This time, it was a private message. From Robert Harlan. Only one sentence. "I owe you an apology." Then another message appeared. "So does my son." A pause. Then a third. "And maybe your husband does too." I read it twice. Something about that last sentence made me sit up straighter. Because for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, somebody besides me had seen exactly what happened. And somehow that mattered. The following Tuesday, I met Robert Harlan for breakfast at a diner near Virginia Beach. Not one of the fancy places. One of those old-school diners where the coffee arrives before you ask for it, and every waitress calls you honey. The parking lot was half full when I pulled in around 8:30. Cold morning. Gray clouds. The kind of damp coastal chill that works its way through your jacket. Robert was already there. Of course he was. The man probably hadn't been late a single day since the Reagan administration. When I walked inside, he was sitting in a booth near the window with a cup of black coffee and a newspaper folded beside him. He stood when he saw me. That alone told me how serious he was. Most retired command master chiefs don't stand up for anybody. "Morning, Dana." "Morning." We sat down. The waitress appeared instantly. Coffee was delivered. Menus were ignored. And for a minute, neither of us said much. Robert stirred his coffee, then looked directly at me. "I'm sorry." Simple. No excuses. No explanations. Just sorry. I appreciated that. "I know." He nodded. "I should have shut Jake down sooner." "Probably. Long before Thanksgiving." That got my attention. I leaned back. "What does that mean?" Robert sighed. The expression on his face reminded me of every senior enlisted leader I'd ever known. The look that said they were tired of cleaning up somebody else's mess. It means Jake has spent years thinking confidence and arrogance are the same thing. I looked out the window. That sounds exhausting. It is. We both laughed. A little. Not much. Then Robert became serious again. "You know why I asked about your call sign?" It wasn't a question. I nodded. "I assumed you recognized it." "I recognized your name." That surprised me. "My name?" Robert took a sip of coffee. "You remember Captain Bill Rawlins?" For a second I just stared at him. Of all the names I expected to hear, that wasn't one of them. "Yeah." "You know him well?" "Not really." That was technically true. The reality was more complicated. Robert studied my face. "You saved his life." I immediately looked away. There it was. The thing I never talked about. The thing I worked very hard not to think about. The thing that somehow followed me anyway. I stared out the diner window at passing traffic. A pickup truck rolled through an intersection. Someone walked a dog. Normal life. Much easier to look at than old memories. "I didn't save anybody," I said quietly. Robert smiled. "I figured you'd say that." "I did my job." "Same thing." "No." He didn't argue. Good man. People who haven't been there always want dramatic stories. Heroes, life-changing moments. The truth is usually messier. Sometimes people survive because 100 different people do their jobs correctly on the same day. I happen to be one of them. That's all. Robert let the silence sit for a moment. Then he changed subjects, which I appreciated. Jake doesn't know any of that. That's obvious. He thinks he knows everything. That's also obvious. Another small laugh. Then Robert's face hardened. There's something else you should know. I had a feeling I wasn't going to like what came next. I was right. Over the next 20 minutes, Robert explained something I'd never fully realized. Jake hadn't started talking about me after Thanksgiving. He'd been doing it for years. Little comments, little jokes, nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would report, just enough to slowly shape opinions. Apparently, every family gathering included some variation of, Dana got lucky. Dana got noticed because she looked good in uniform. Dana probably hadn't flown in years. Dana was one of those officers who spent more time talking than working. I listened quietly. The more Robert talked, the angrier I became. Not explosive anger. The slow kind. The dangerous kind. The kind that settles deep and stays there. What did people say? I asked. Robert hesitated. That told me everything. What? He sighed. Some believed him. I laughed once. Short. Sharp. Fantastic. They shouldn't have. But they did. He nodded. Some did. That hurt more than I expected. Not because strangers believed it. Because family did. People I'd spent holidays with. People who smiled at me. People who apparently listened to Jake when I wasn't in the room. The waitress refilled our coffee. Neither of us touched it. Finally, Robert said, I wanted you to hear it from me. Why? Because if this gets worse, you'll know where it started. That was an interesting choice of words. If this gets worse. Not if Jake stops. Not if things improve. If this gets worse. Like he already knew his son. Which, to be fair, he did. After breakfast, I drove back to Norfolk feeling heavier than when I'd arrived. Not emotionally shattered. Just tired. Tired of realizing how long this had been happening. Tired of discovering conversations I was never invited into. Tired of learning how many people preferred the easier story. The story where a woman succeeds because of appearance instead of competence. That afternoon, I met my friend Renee Ortiz for coffee near base. Renee and I had known each other for years. Lieutenant Commander. Smart. Blunt. One of the few people who could tell me uncomfortable truths without making me defensive. She took one look at my face and said, Who do I need to hit with a truck? I laughed. For real this time. That's why we're friends. Seriously. She pointed at me. You look terrible. Thank you. You're welcome. We sat outside despite the cold. Military people are weird like that. Give us coffee and sunlight, and we'll sit anywhere. I told her everything. The dinner. The jokes. The conversation with Robert. The years of gossip. When I finished, Renee shook her head. He's insecure. I know. No, I mean professionally insecure. I frowned. What do you mean? She pulled out her phone, scrolled through something, then slid it across the table. Because people who feel secure don't spend this much time talking about other people. I looked down. The screen showed a promotional flyer. Joint Readiness Leadership Luncheon. Naval Station Norfolk. 3 weeks away. Guest presenters. Community leaders. Senior officers. Retired personnel. And right there in the middle was a photo of Jake. Featured speaker. Leadership in a changing Navy. I stared at it. Then looked at her. You're kidding. Nope. I laughed again. This time it wasn't amusement. It was disbelief. Leadership. That's the title. Of course it is. Renee smirked. Then her expression changed. Something crossed her face. Something thoughtful. What? She hesitated. For the first time all afternoon. That immediately got my attention. What? Renee reached into her bag, pulled out her phone again, opened a photo, then handed it to me. The second I saw it, my stomach dropped. A presentation slide. Draft version. Not final, but definitely real. There was a blurred photograph in the center. Most people wouldn't recognize it. I did. Because it was me, standing in uniform at a family barbecue 2 years earlier. The caption underneath read, "Perception versus performance, when image gets ahead of experience." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I read it again, then again. Maybe I was misunderstanding. Maybe there was context. Maybe number. There wasn't. Renee watched my face carefully. "I thought you should see it." "Where did this come from?" "Someone reviewing the presentation flagged it." I stared at the image. At my image. Used as a punchline. Used as an example. Used as evidence for an argument Jake wanted to make. A cold feeling settled in my chest. Not rage. Not yet. Something sharper. Something clearer. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I stopped feeling hurt. And started paying attention. Because this wasn't family gossip anymore. This wasn't a stupid joke at a dinner table. This had crossed into something else entirely. And suddenly, I understood exactly why Robert had warned me. If this gets worse. The problem was, it already had. I didn't sleep much that night. Again. Not because I was angry. At least not only because I was angry. I was trying to figure out what bothered me most. The photo. The caption. The fact that Jake had apparently been carrying this resentment around for years. Or the possibility that if Renee hadn't shown me the slide, I never would have known any of it was happening. Around midnight, I found myself sitting on the back patio with a blanket around my shoulders and a cup of coffee I definitely didn't need. Norfolk was quiet. A few porch lights glowed across the neighborhood. Somebody's dog barked once in the distance. Cold air rolled in from the water. I stared into the darkness and tried to be honest with myself. Part of me wanted revenge. Not justice. Not accountability. Revenge. The ugly version. The emotional version. The version where you stop caring about consequences. I hated admitting that. But it was true. I was tired. Tired people don't always want wisdom. Sometimes they want somebody else to hurt too. The problem was that every time I imagined embarrassing Jake, another thought followed. What happens afterward? Because that's the thing nobody talks about. Winning isn't always clean. Sometimes you still have to live with the fallout. And in this case, the fallout included my husband, my marriage, and a family I was still going to see at Christmas. The next morning I showed Mark the slide. His reaction wasn't what I expected. At first, he just stared at it, silent. Then he looked at me, then back at the phone. His face slowly drained of color. "Oh." That was all he said. "Oh." I laughed, not because it was funny. Because after everything that had happened, somehow that tiny word carried more weight than 100 apologies. "Oh." The moment he saw proof, everything became real. Not a misunderstanding. Not teasing. Not family being family. Proof. "Now do you get it?" I asked. Mark nodded slowly. "Yeah." "You sure?" "Yeah." He sat down heavily at the kitchen table. For a while neither of us spoke. Then he rubbed his forehead. "This is bad." I almost smiled. "That's your expert analysis." "Dana." "I'm kidding." "No, you're not." "Fair point." Mark stared at the slide again. "He actually used your picture." "Yep." What was he thinking? I leaned back. He wasn't. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I saw genuine anger in my husband's face. Not defensive anger. Protective anger. And oddly enough, that made me sad. Because where had this been 3 weeks ago? Eventually, he looked up. "What are you going to do?" That was the question. Wasn't it? What was I going to do? I still didn't know. Later that afternoon, Renee called. "Did you show him?" "Yep." "How'd he take it?" Like a man realizing he's accidentally been standing in the wrong line for 3 weeks. Renee laughed. "That's about what I expected." Then her voice became serious. "Listen carefully. Whenever military people say, 'Listen carefully,' you should probably listen carefully." I talked to the event coordinator. My stomach tightened. "And the slide's already been flagged." I sat up straighter. "What does that mean?" "It means somebody reviewing the presentation thought it was inappropriate." "Good." "It also means Jake was asked to remove it." I blinked. "Was?" "Yes." A pause. Then, "He refused." For a moment I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly. He what? He argued. I stood up from the couch. You're kidding. Nope. About a photo he didn't have permission to use. Apparently he felt strongly about his point. I walked into the kitchen, then back out again, then into the kitchen again. Movement helps me think. Sometimes. Not always. What happened? The coordinator escalated it. To who? Several people. I stopped walking. Several people. In military language, that's usually where bad days begin. What kind of several people? Renee laughed. The kind you don't want reading your emails. That wasn't encouraging. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. The situation had changed. Significantly. Until now, this had mostly been personal. A family issue. An arrogant cousin. A private insult. But Jake had been given an opportunity to correct the mistake. And according to Renee, he'd doubled down. That mattered. A lot. Because arrogance is one thing. Refusing correction is another. Around 6 that evening, my phone buzzed. Robert Harlan. I answered. Hello. Dana. His voice sounded tired. Hey. I heard. Of course he had. Small military community. News traveled fast. I figured. A long pause followed. Then Robert sighed. I had a conversation with my son. I wasn't sure whether to ask. Part of me didn't want details. Curiosity won. How'd that go? Robert laughed once. Not happily. Poorly. I can imagine. He's convinced everyone is overreacting. That sounded exactly like Jake. Robert continued. He thinks people are attacking him. I leaned against the kitchen counter. Funny how that works. What do you mean? People who throw punches are always shocked when someone notices. That got another laugh. This one slightly more genuine. Then Robert surprised me. Dana. Yeah. You planning to report him? I considered the question. Honestly, longer than he probably expected. I don't know. Good. That wasn't the response I expected. Good. You're still thinking. I frowned. What does that mean? It means anger hasn't made your decision yet. I looked out the kitchen window. The sky was turning orange, sunset reflecting off neighboring rooftops. For some reason, Robert's words stayed with me. Anger hasn't made your decision yet. That was exactly what I was trying to avoid. The easy path would have been filing a complaint. There were probably 3 different regulations Jake had wandered into. Maybe more. But every time I thought about formal punishment, something stopped me. Not sympathy. Not fear. Something else. I wanted him exposed. Not destroyed. There was a difference. A few days later, I met Renee near base for lunch. She arrived carrying a folder. Physical paper, which immediately made me nervous. What is that? Information. I hate when you say that. You should. She slid into the booth across from me, opened the folder. Inside were event schedules, speaker lists, review notes, and attendee information. I skimmed through it, then froze. One name jumped out immediately. Captain William Rollins. Guest attendee. I looked up, slowly. You're kidding. Nope. I stared at the page. Captain Bill Rollins. The same man Robert had mentioned. The same man connected to a night I'd spent years trying not to revisit. The same man Jake clearly knew nothing about. A strange feeling settled over me. Not satisfaction. Not yet. Something closer to inevitability. Like pieces of a puzzle quietly sliding into place. Renee watched my face. What are you thinking? I looked down at the attendee list again, then back at her. The universe has a weird sense of humor. She smiled. That it does. The luncheon was 4 days away. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I wasn't focused on what Jake had done. I was focused on what would happen if he kept talking. And judging by everything I'd learned about Jake Harlan, he absolutely would. The question wasn't whether he was walking into trouble. The question was how far he'd get before he realized it. The morning of the luncheon started with rain. Not a storm. Just that steady Virginia drizzle that turns everything gray and makes traffic worse. I woke up before my alarm. 5:12 a.m. For a few seconds I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to remember why my stomach felt tight. Then I remembered. The luncheon. Jake. The slide. Everything. Beside me, Mark was already awake. I could tell by the way he was pretending to be asleep. Married people know. I rolled onto my side. You awake? A pause. Then. Yep. Thought so. Neither of us moved for a moment. Finally, Mark sighed. You don't have to go. I looked at him. That's not really an option. It could be. No. He nodded, because he knew I was right. This wasn't about proving something anymore. My absence would become part of the story, and I was tired of other people writing stories about me. By 7:30, we were on our way to Naval Station Norfolk. The rain had slowed to a mist. Ships sat dark against the water. Traffic crawled through the gates. People in uniform moved between buildings carrying coffee cups and backpacks. Normal weekday military life. The kind I'd spent most of my adult years around. For some reason that comforted me. The base felt familiar, predictable, unlike family. The event was being held inside a conference building near the waterfront. Nothing fancy, just a large meeting room with rows of chairs, a projector screen, coffee stations, and round tables near the back. By the time Mark and I arrived, people were already gathering. Retired officers, active duty personnel, civilian contractors, community leaders, a few spouses, the usual mix. I checked in and scanned the room. Almost immediately I spotted Robert. He was sitting near the front, coffee in hand, expression unreadable. When he saw me, he gave a small nod. Nothing more. I appreciated that. No dramatic conversation. No last-minute advice. Just acknowledgement. Across the room I finally saw Jake, standing beside the projector, laughing, shaking hands, working the crowd. He looked completely comfortable, completely confident. Like a man who had no idea a cliff was 2 steps behind him. Mark followed my gaze. How is he still smiling? I almost laughed. Practice. A few minutes later, Renee arrived. She slipped into the chair beside me. You okay? No. Good. I looked at her. Good. If you were comfortable right now, I'd be worried. Fair enough. The room gradually filled. At 11:35, the event began. A moderator welcomed everyone, introduced the speakers, thanked sponsors, all the usual stuff. Then Jake took the stage, and for the first 10 minutes, honestly, he did well. That was the frustrating part. Jake wasn't stupid. He wasn't incompetent. He was charismatic, confident, comfortable in front of people. The audience responded. People nodded, laughed at his jokes, took notes. For a moment, I almost wondered whether I'd built him into something larger than he really was. Then he kept talking, and Jake did what Jake always did. He started believing his own performance. That's when the trouble began. He moved into a section about leadership and public perception. The audience remained engaged. Everything still looked normal. Then he said, "One challenge facing today's military is image management." A few people nodded. Jake continued, "The public loves a clean story, a clean uniform, a good photo." Something cold settled in my stomach. I already knew where this was heading. Across the room, Renee slowly folded her arms. Robert stared straight ahead. Jake clicked the remote. The next slide appeared. There it was. The photo. My photo. Blurred slightly, but recognizable, at least to anyone who knew me. The caption appeared underneath. Perception versus performance. When image gets ahead of experience, a few people shifted in their seats. Not many. Just enough. Jake smiled. Confident. Relaxed. Unaware. We have to be careful, he said, that we don't confuse visibility with value. I felt Mark tense beside me. His jaw tightened. For a second I considered staying silent. Seriously, I thought about it. I could let the room move on. I could avoid the confrontation. I could leave afterward and never speak to Jake again. Easy, simple, comfortable. Then I remembered Thanksgiving. I remembered staring at my husband's plate while everybody laughed. I remembered the bathroom mirror. I remembered every quiet little rumor I'd learned about. And suddenly, I was done being comfortable. I stood up. Not dramatically, just stood. The room noticed immediately. Jake noticed too. His smile faltered. Slightly. Lieutenant Harlan, I said. His expression tightened. Then he recovered. Professional voice. Professional smile. Yes, ma'am. I pointed toward the screen. Who gave you permission to use that image? Silence. Instant. Complete. Jake glanced toward the screen, then back at me. It's anonymized. That's not what I asked. The room grew even quieter. Somewhere behind me a chair creaked. Jake shifted his weight. It's being used as a general example. Of what? The smile disappeared. A leadership concept. What leadership concept? Jake's confidence began slipping. Not much. Just enough. The difference between image and performance. I nodded slowly. Did you verify the performance of the officer in that photograph? No answer. A few people exchanged looks. Jake laughed nervously. I think we're getting overly focused on the example. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't take a step forward. Didn't need to. You used the example. More silence. Then a voice spoke from the front row. Old. Calm. Steady. That's a fair question. Every head turned. Captain Bill Rollins slowly stood up. The cane beside his chair helped him rise. But once he was standing, the room paid attention. The kind of attention that rank can't command. Only reputation. Jake looked confused. Rollins looked at the screen. Then at Jake. Then finally at me. His expression softened. Just briefly. Before turning serious again. Do you know who that officer is, Lieutenant? Jake swallowed. No, sir. I know. The room remained completely still. Rollins pointed toward me. Her call sign is jukebox. The air seemed to leave the room. Jake blinked. Twice. Rollins continued. Years ago, a lot of good people made good decisions during a very bad night. He paused. A man I cared about came home because of those decisions. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Rollins looked directly at Jake. And one of those people was her. Jake's face lost color. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough that everyone noticed. Finally, he managed. Sir, I didn't know. Rollins nodded. Exactly. The words landed harder than any yelling could have. Because they were true. Jake didn't know. He never cared enough to know. He had judged first. Researched never. And now the bill had arrived. Jake tried one last time. I wasn't criticizing her specifically. I spoke before Rollins could. Then why use my photo? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The room watched, waiting. Jake looked toward the audience, toward the moderator, toward anyone who might save him. Nobody did. Then Mark stood up. For the first time all morning. For the first time since Thanksgiving. Jake! His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Take the slide down. Jake looked shocked. Mark, take it down. I stared at my husband. Honestly, I wasn't expecting that. Not here. Not now. But there he was, finally choosing a side. Jake looked trapped. Because he was. Not by me. By his own decisions. Then Robert stood. Slowly. The room became completely silent. Son. Jake turned. Dad. No. Robert's voice remained calm, which somehow made it worse. I spent 30 years teaching sailors to respect the uniform. Nobody moved. Nobody even coughed. Robert looked at his son, then at the slide, then back again. Somewhere along the way you learned to respect attention more. The sentence hit like a hammer, because it came from the one person Jake wanted approval from most. And everyone knew it. Jake stared at the floor. The moderator quietly removed the slide. The projector changed. The image disappeared. Just like that. Gone. But the damage remained. A few minutes later, the session ended early. People stood. Conversations started. Quiet ones. Professional ones. The kind nobody enjoys being the subject of. Outside, the rain had stopped. Clouds drifted over the harbor. I stood near the parking lot watching ships in the distance. Eventually, Jake approached. Alone. No audience this time. No microphone. No applause. Just us. He stopped a few feet away. You happy now? I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time, I didn't see confidence. I saw fear. No. Jake frowned. Then what was the point? I thought about that. About Thanksgiving. About the slide. About everything. Then I answered. The point is, you don't get to make me smaller just because you're scared you aren't big enough. Jake had absolutely nothing to say to that. And for once in his life, silence belonged to him. For a while, things got worse, not better. That's probably the part most people don't expect. Stories usually end after the confrontation. The truth is, that's often where the real mess begins. The luncheon happened on a Thursday. By Saturday afternoon, half the family had already picked a side, and unfortunately some of them didn't pick mine. I was standing in the kitchen making coffee when my phone started buzzing. Text after text. Aunt Patty, Mark's sister, a cousin from Richmond I only saw twice a year. Everyone suddenly had an opinion. Most of them had somehow missed the fact that Jake had used my photo without permission. Instead, they focused on the uncomfortable outcome. Apparently, I had embarrassed him. Funny how that works. The person causing the problem gets sympathy. The person exposing the problem gets criticism. One message stood out. It came from Ellen Harlan, Jake's mother. I read it twice. Dana, I wish you could have handled this with a little more grace. Family should protect family. I stared at the screen, then set the phone face down on the counter. Not because I was angry, because I was tired. There comes a point in life when you stop explaining obvious things. A few minutes later, Mark walked into the kitchen. He looked at my face, then at the phone. Bad. I laughed softly. Depends. On what? Whether we're measuring honesty or popularity. That got a small smile out of him, the first one I'd seen in days. The smile disappeared quickly, because there was still something sitting between us, something neither of us had fully addressed. That evening, we sat on the back patio. The weather had finally cleared. Cool air, clear sky. A cargo ship moved slowly through the distance beyond the Elizabeth River. For a while, we just sat there. Then Mark spoke. I owe you an apology. I kept looking out toward the water. I know. No. His voice sounded different, more certain. I mean a real one. That got my attention. I turned toward him. Mark took a breath. When Jake went after you at Thanksgiving, I was thinking about keeping the peace. I nodded. I know. I thought staying quiet was the safest option. Another nod. Then he looked directly at me. I understand now that I wasn't protecting peace. I waited. He swallowed. I was protecting myself. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The honesty surprised me, because it was uncomfortable. And uncomfortable truths are usually the real ones. Finally, I said, Yeah. Mark nodded. I know. The old version of him would have stopped there, moved on, tried to smooth things over. This time he didn't. I should have backed you up. You should have. I was wrong. Yes. A sad smile appeared. You're really making me earn this. I almost laughed. You've had 3 weeks to prepare. That finally got a real laugh from both of us. The first genuine one since Thanksgiving. Then Mark became serious again. I don't expect you to get over it overnight. Good. I just need you to know I understand. I looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you. Relief flashed across his face. Before he could say anything else, I added, But I need different, not sorry. The relief disappeared, replaced by understanding, which was exactly what I wanted. Because apologies matter. Changed behavior matters more. Over the next few months, things slowly settled. Not perfectly. Nothing ever does. Jake's presentation was reviewed. Questions were asked. His promotion package didn't move forward that year. Nobody publicly destroyed him. Nobody ended his career. But people started paying closer attention. And sometimes that's enough. The funny thing was, the professional consequences bothered him less than the personal ones. For the first time in his life, people stopped automatically believing him. That was new territory, especially with his father. Robert and I spoke occasionally after that. Mostly short conversations. Baseball, weather, Navy stories that somehow always turned into life lessons. One afternoon he called and said, You know he's miserable. I laughed. I figured.